The fifth applied precept. I bear witness to the reality of delusion and the desire to evade the painful truths of life in myself and in the world, and aspire to experience reality directly, with clarity and kindness to self and others. If the previous three precepts have been concerned in their different ways with truth, then this one is basically about our bullshitting. Working with this precept gives us an unparalleled opportunity to watch and listen as we spin stories founded in delusion. Stories that shape the experiencing of our world and our actions in it. Stories to justify the otherwise unjustifiable. Things we'd never believe if we weren't already in the grip of deep delusion. It's the kind of thing Joko has in mind when she asks, rhetorically, why we don't practice, why we avoid and stumble over the slightest obstacle, why if obstacles are lacking we will cheerfully invent them, why we'll even come up with an absorbing activity we call practice that we can use as just another strategy of avoidance, of turning away. Why won't we practice? Joko's answer is clear: because we don't want to. Or to take this a step further, because we do and don't want to, because we are multiple. I'm still determined that I am giving up smoking as my hand reaches for the cigarette. The object of our investigation with this precept is our turning away from the experiencing of our life as it is, and the direct experiencing, the bringing to awareness of that turning away. I found much insight in listening to the responses of new students and the world at large to thinking about this precept, and most specifically those related to its original subject, the use of alcohol. For many, I think actually for most people, suggesting their use of alcohol may be problematic, both for themselves as an individual and as part of a much wider social problem, brings out their resistance, as always a red flag in our practice. And even if this is something they can appreciate in theory, the suggestion that they might want to reduce or eliminate their drinking as part of Buddhist practice evokes reactions that swing between panic, confusion, incredulity and outright hostility. The traditional interpretation of this precept does ask us to do exactly that: stop using alcohol. Our ordinary mind approach is more interested in why even the idea of stopping drinking seems so difficult for us, and asks us to become curious about that resistance to it and what that might tell us about the ways in which we actually use alcohol. What are we really doing? We see at once that lying, stealing, killing and so on are wrong, and if we find it hard to entirely match our behaviour to those standards, then we don't challenge the standards themselves. We're not looking for get-outs. Do I have to give up alcohol entirely to be a Buddhist? How much is okay? Is it okay to have a beer with a meal? Is it okay as long as I don't get drunk? People never ask, do I have to stop stealing? How much am I allowed to steal a day if I'm a Buddhist? How many lies can I tell and how big? Can I kill someone slightly, or if it's only on Tuesdays? Is that okay? Anyone who gives up drinking for whatever reason will be familiar with the implicit challenge this poses for those around you. And that may include your family. It will definitely include your friends, co-workers, people you meet for the first time at a party, or other social drinking contexts. They'll probably assume that you're an alcoholic or on serious medication, or if you do try to explain about Buddhism, then they will be clear in their own minds that you've definitely joined some kind of cult intent on forcing you to stop. Why aren't you drinking? Exactly those mechanisms or social inclusion and exclusion we looked at in the previous precepts apply here. Your decision to not drink contradicts the stories I tell and am told around alcohol. That its use is normal and for most people benign or even helpful. That it's my free choice as to whether I drink and when and how much. I don't have a drink problem, I just like the taste. I use it to relax, enjoy myself with friends, because I just like a drink. Those of a certain age will remember the first government campaigns linking the newly recognised AIDS, HIV, to drug use. They featured a stereotypically derelict junkie, pale and sunken-eyed, huddled in the corner of a bare room saying, "I'm not an addict, I've just got a touch of flu today." I think the copywriter nailed the key delusion of addiction, and one that fits perfectly our society's use of alcohol. Not of alcoholics, but of all of us as a culture. Since at least the time of Hogarth, that's the mid-18th century, there have been campaigns against the all-too-obvious social and personal costs of our society's addiction, culminating in prohibition in the United States in the 20s and 30s. These have always been represented, part fairly and part unfairly, as moralising intervention by the middle classes, trying to spoil the innocent fun of the common man. Doing so plays into a rhetoric of pleasure and resistance, my right to a drink if I want one. This is, of course, the same rhetoric which, in more extreme form, has given us the populism of the far right. It's no coincidence that figures such as Boris Johnson and Nigel Farage have so often had themselves pictured pint in hand. Note that I don't have to tell you pint of what. So, drink. No, I don't mean water, and the euphemism itself tells us so much. Do you still think we don't have a drink problem? Practice questions. How do you feel reading this? What physical, what emotional reaction do you have? What thoughts come up? What do you think I'm telling you to do? To give up all alcohol? Would this be a problem for you? Reread it. No, please actually do reread it. Repeat. For the record, our work with this precept is not telling you that you have to or should stop drinking, or even that you should feel guilty about it. Guilty is just another feeling to investigate. Our work with the precepts is ongoing investigation, not prescription or limitation. It may be difficult, it may sometimes make us wince or cringe, but it should have the character of liberation, not self-punishment or self-denial. We investigate our reactions, our resistance, and the language and arguments we use. Those reactions I mentioned above, and the reactions to my or your not drinking, the perplexity, even hostility, shows we're close to something important and painful for us. You wouldn't feel the same if I told you not to lie, to steal, to kill. Nobody tells me not to kill someone. Doesn't sound quite right, does it? That's because we're talking about addiction here, about delusion and the way it distorts our perceptions. But just to make it clear, I'm not in any way telling you to give up alcohol, your drink. Just inviting you to investigate our language, our responses, our experiencing. So if alcohol really isn't your thing, if take it or leave it really is how you feel, then this is the moment to shift your attention to whatever does bring up the feeling of irritation, of anger, fear, panic when you think of giving it up, stopping, doing without. Any of those of our supports that demand something of us and keep coming back for more. Smoking, gaming, news feeds, gossip. It might even be arranging my shoes, whatever. Practice questions. What do I turn to when I'm feeling low, stressed out, or I simply want to relax? Are they an important part of me, or do I think of them as guilty pleasures? How would I describe my involvement with them to someone else? This is where our practice with this precept begins. As always, it's investigation. And as the result of this always ongoing investigation, we may find that our behaviour in the world has changed, that our ideas, our thinking, our views are different, and we may want to make intentional and rational choices about what we do. But in this context, nothing is allowed or forbidden. Let's turn as usual to Diane Rossetto's chapter on the precept. Her approach, as always, is broad and non-judgmental. Originally, this precept focused on the use of alcohol, but later it was expanded to include the use of other substances like marijuana, tranquilizers, hallucinogens, and so forth. Today we can think of more subtle ways we turn from being present by using and abusing not only mind-altering drugs, but also caffeine, cigarettes, food and activities like exercise, TV watching, internet surfing, work, sensory highs, or anything that can turn us from the immediate experience of our minds and bodies. It's this immediate experiencing that is the heart of our practice, both as body sensations and emotions felt in the moment, but also as the patterns of thought and deeper connections that become apparent over time. If the aim of our practice is, at one level, to maintain this continuity of experiencing, then why, to return to Joko's initial question, do we find ourselves so often turning away from it? So, back to Diane. In exploring this precept, we focus not so much on what particular drugs or activities are acceptable to use, but rather what our intention is and how we can use any substance or engage in any activity that drives us further into our habitual ways of meeting the events and circumstances of everyday life. My point is that alcohol, drugs, TV, whatever, are not escapes in and of themselves. What makes them escapes is how we use them. This is an important point, an important part of our practice. In our initial investigations, we suspend, as always, our judgment of ourselves and of others. We observe our habitual turning away and its patterns of connections. Diane. Our approach to this precept is not to determine how or to what extent a substance or an activity may cloud or alter our experience, but rather to point to how we may use and abuse them by obscuring the wisdom and intelligence present in life as it is in any moment, any event, in any place. This precept is about the ways we use whatever substance to alter or escape our experience. Which brings us back to the why with which we began. Why don't we want to be present? Why don't we want our experiencing of life as it is? Why do we turn away? The experience of one of Diane's students can take us to the heart of this. He's not an addict or an alcoholic, just a regular guy or gal coming home from work to their family. Student. As I work with this precept, I realise that I have expectations that I should experience certain feelings around certain situations. For example, I should feel happy when I get home from work at night and see my partner and kids. When I don't, I often reach for a beer or a glass of wine so that I can relax and loosen up in order to enjoy them more. I know my intention is to relax, but would that be such a bad thing if it allows me to be there and enjoy my family more? Would you call this addiction? Diane. But are you really there? Would there be another way to be there and honour the tenseness rather than ignoring it? This is what your practice can offer you. There's a way of talking about addiction much like what you might be describing here. A requirement that causes us to act in body, speech and mind in a certain way in order to alter our experience. What is your requirement here? Student. That I will always be relaxed and enjoy coming home and being with my family. Diane. Where is it written that you must always be relaxed and enjoy your family? This question is your point of entry. Grab this question with your life before you reach for the bottle of beer. You'll learn something. I don't know what that will be. This is your discovery. Own it. Your addiction is your requirement, not the beer or the wine. Absolutely, though I'd like to take this a little farther. Diane's use of requirement here offers us a powerful tool, though not one without its own dangers. Recognizing our requirement is a vital step. I need it to be this way, not that way. In order to feel like me, in order to feel comfortable or less uncomfortable, being me in this situation, I need things to be this way. So, first point, if we're aware of it at all, our requirement will normally be felt as a tug, a need, an intimate and personal distress that brings me into self-consciousness as lacking, inadequate. Back to all our usual stuff. So requirement links this experience to the experience of self, of being separate and lacking. This is the experience we can talk about as selfing. My construction of my sense of being this self and the delusion involved in so doing. Important point. Yet requirement also has that same whiff of a moralizing, personalizing sense that, to be honest, I often pick up from Joko, and which I think finally weakens her teaching. It's all about me and my foolish, wrong-headed requirement. So why don't I just drop it and act like a grown-up? Well, maybe. I think instead it's more interesting almost to ask, okay, where did this requirement come from? Not in the sense of trying always to chase back to my personal trauma or core beliefs, but instead letting the circle move gently outwards from myself in isolation to ever broader circles of relationship. I'm not looking to pin blame or find the answer, but instead just map the territory, as I did first with my own feelings and thoughts. This is something we can each do with our dis-ease in our becoming aware of it, simply allowing ourselves to open to the social fields that shape our experiencing. So I don't know the truth of this student of Diane's any more than I did with those in her previous case studies that we've looked at, but we can easily map some possible points of reference. I assume that she or he is coming home in the evening from work, an intense time of focused activity on specified tasks and in hierarchical relationships. Maybe she or he is put upon by their boss, who's being leaned on by their boss in turn, and while it's stressful, at least the rules of being at work, what's part of it and part not, are relatively closely defined. She or he is used to deferring at work and largely being ignored, and now they're needing some validation, the deference or admiration of the children, recognition by the partner of the valuable contribution they're making to the family under difficult circumstances. Or maybe she or he is the boss, used to giving orders, receiving the deference of others, their personal assistant anticipating their every need. And then she or he arrives at home to the chaos and differing priorities of family. Their partner too may have been at work all day, or at home juggling the infinite varied tasks of family life, while the children will probably be, according to their ages, dispositions, and own social experience. How was your day at school? A mixture of need, raw energy, stonewalling, insecurity, and probably also love. All of them will have different requirements which are actually perhaps better seen as their assumptions and expectations of family life. Where do these come from for any of us? Our own home as positive or negative model figures large. The images we pick up from films and TV, conversations with friends and co-workers. How should it be? How is it supposed to feel? A sanctuary from the outside world? That my family are the meaning of life for me? That they expect me to work all day and then come home to work another shift? We can't think about any of this without asking questions about work-life balance, employment conditions, domestic arrangements, and the explicit and implicit hierarchies within and between traditional and non-traditional gender roles. We might finally get to another key binary inequality, the distinction between public, the world of work and social life, and private, my family, my home, and how our society understands the relationship between public and private as experientially hermetically sealed spheres, each making their own demands, each offering us different possibilities of who I really am, and often being in competition. This isn't human nature, but the choices that have been made for us about how our society is organised, and over which we have relatively little significant personal choice, and about our collective values. Practice questions. What situations do I find my requirements showing up in? What do these tell me about myself and my selfing? What do they tell me about my relationships with others and with the wider world? If we see Diane's students' requirement as their business alone, their problem in requiring their situation to be other than it is, then we see them as separate and failing to engage with their life as it is. Or we can also see their experiencing emerging out of a whole field of different relationships that place stresses and demands on them that are sometimes explicit and sometimes tacit, but understood. Why does she or he open the fridge to get a beer? Because coming home, experiencing this sudden shift of being between one set of relationships and another is painful. It hurts in its difference and in its demands and in the uncertainty of what will be asked of them by their partner and children. Where I think Diane is exactly right is in her question, would there be another way to be there and honour the tenseness rather than ignoring it? Which is to ask them to take life whole, to see that their desire to turn away and the discomfort that provokes it are both part of life as it is, both part of this complex of relationships. How does this actually feel? And what are the feelings beneath which she or he and we are working so hard not to feel? To remind ourselves of another of Diane's excellent practice questions, what's the worst that could happen if I allow myself this feeling and meet my family without the support of beer or wine? What's the worst that could happen? My guess is we're not too far from exactly the kind of feelings we explored in relation to the Sixth Precept. Those around our identity, our relation to gender, and finally the experience of shame. How do we address this? We address it as relationship, both with our own fears and fantasies, our own shame, and through genuine relationship with exactly those others in relation to whom we feel the need to hide from our own wholeness. In Diane's students' case, their family. How do both partners feel when the other gets in? We need to ask exactly the same questions around their partner's experience as we did of their own. And the children? Ditto. All this is life as it is, and it is as relationship that it needs to be worked through. The Sixth Precept is clear what the process needs to be. Can each come to meet the others with openness and possibility? Our practice is towards making this happen. It's not me, it's us. To see this as only being my business, to see it as My responsibility is to come perilously close to falling into exactly that pit of shame that gives us the illusion of our isolating and individual separation from others, an illusion the more destructive and perverse in that it is always socially constructed. I can only be my shamed and separated self in relation to the world of others. It's also to offer me a fantasy of control I can never make real. The whole point about our practice with life as it is to recognise not simply the limits to my ability to control my life, but to problematise the notion of control itself. We do not need to compound our existing delusions in this area. Taking myself whole is to expand my limited notion of self to include all aspects of myself, myselves, and my relationships as they show up as my experiencing. I have to include, to make space for, to allow the painful truths of the world to be recognised as and in myself, myselves. Joko's basic image of practice as fostering our growth and becoming a bigger container in our ability to be with what is painful to us is central here. For all of us, this is hard, and for most of us, this will sometimes be impossible. But even recognising this impossibility is something. The whole point about trauma is that it's not easily managed for the very reason that our trauma isolates us from ourselves and automates and makes reflexive our emotions and our reactions to what are always in reality complex and nuanced situations. In my turning away from aspects of my experiencing, there is also always a turning towards, as I displace and limit the fullness of my awareness and attention by dissociating from what I experience as painful. I may wish instead to soothe myself, to numb out or excite, or I may wish simply for myself to vanish, be it for now or forever. In reality, all of these solutions are problematic. Whatever self-states I enter, I become, are inevitably shaped, configured in relation to what I have dissociated from as not me. I may recognise this as the here be monsters of terra incognita, or the not me may instead function far more dangerously like the blind spot on my retina, something of which I'm completely unaware in what appears to me as a full, consistent and coherent vision of the world. At which point we have to ask again, what forces shape these self-states? And are these self-states purely individual or to common patterns? We've become aware over our previous work with the precepts of the ways in which the habits and preconceptions of our societal norms seem to offer us easy answers to life's hard questions, that we consequently come to judge and shame, and are judged and shamed in our turn, as if we were each thoroughly self-consistent and entirely separate individuals engaged in a permanent competition of all against all. In so doing, we become unwittingly complicit in our self-limitation and the limitation of all beings. This is where we return to Diane Rossetto's framing of this precept as pointing to how we may come to obscure the wisdom and intelligence present in life as it is in any moment, any event, and in any place. Easy answers for life's harder experiences and questions that separate ourselves from both the wholeness of ourselves and of our relationships with others, a wholeness which, of course, always includes our pain, our resistance, our dis-ease. Many of our turnings away are harmless, or at least not actively damaging to ourselves or others. We are often simply too much for ourselves, both in ourselves and in our relationships to others. There is no simple line dividing harmless and harmful evasions, hence the need for thorough and sustained investigation in the direction of becoming more open and self-honest. The difficulty is that it's of the nature of the very process of dissociation that it excludes aspects of our own experiencing, and so leads us in the direction of self-states that make sense of and appear to justify the unjustifiable. We become blind to the harming that we suffer and to the harming that we do. Thich Nhat Hanh talked of the collective body as one aspect of interdependence and interbeing, and Zen teachers often speak of us all being one body. This idea is very relevant to how we think about and practice with the precepts, though it's easy to get mystical with it. We need to examine how the collective body shows up as us in our everyday lives and in the broader patterns of our society. So I need to put my liking a drink or needing a drink in context. We began to do this looking at Diane's student's situation. Why might they feel that they need a drink or that one will help? We could extend the investigation to note that alcohol is a socially sanctioned mood-adjusting drug, produced and promoted by a massive industry, and that its advertising is ubiquitous and relentless. We've learnt to associate using alcohol with good times, with sharing with our friends and family, with being ourselves and letting our hair down. This industrial product is marketed as an essential part of our personal expression, of our exercising our ability to discriminate and judge, and even as a subversive and transgressive blow against a straight-laced and moralising society. It promises freedom, freedom from our cares and responsibilities, freedom just to be our true selves, however we imagine our true selves. Whereas the Friday night drunk, the solo drinker, the driver who lost control, the night that ended in a fight or in sex they didn't really want or weren't even able to consent to, and let alone the actual alcoholic. These are all someone else, an other, who whether we pity or damn them as can't cope, can't take the drink, or perhaps they have an addictive personality, related to personal trauma or poor genes. Whatever way, they are nothing to do with us. And their existence is no reason to spoil our fun. Of course, we also know, if we care to investigate even minimally, that as a result of the sheer scale of its use, alcohol is the world's most dangerous drug. It's a disinhibitor, allowing violence of all kinds and active expression it would otherwise lack. The links between alcohol use and domestic violence of all kinds are particularly well established, as are alcohol's effects on our collective violence, for example that of sports fans, weekend revellers, or those of us who get behind the wheel of a car being only one over the limit. Some of the health consequences of both its acute and long-term use are well known, from depression to liver failure, but others are only becoming apparent. My seeming unique and personal wish to avoid the more potentially painful moments of my own life is part and parcel of all this, a world of human beings engaged in billions of moment-by-moment turnings away that both produce and are produced by a relationship to the dissociation strategies we use and their associated self-states. We are not separate from any of this. I'll bring us back to the bullshit around which we began. Alcohol helps us turn away not only from the immediate experiencing of our life as it is, but from the actual effects of our individual and collective consumption. We find ourselves in self-states where our using makes sense and appears completely rational to us. An example of the mental gymnastics involved in using a different substance might help clarify this. Philippa Perry, the Guardian newspaper's resident psychotherapist, each week takes a reader's question as her subject for a short piece. Here's one from September 2023. The reader's question. I'm a woman in my late 50s. In my teens, I took a great many drugs, among them heroin. Every few years, I feel the irresistible urge to go back, and I do, using a few times a month over a 6-month period. Then I become afraid and I'm able to stop. However, I honestly feel my use is not problematic or doing me any harm. Should I just stop worrying about this and accept that this is me? I know about other people who use in this way. I'm an educated, well-off professional in a stable relationship. My upbringing, although privileged, was very unhappy and pretty messed up. My parents both had major mental health problems and alcohol dependency, and both eventually died by suicide. I was cared for by multiple other family members, nannies, boarding schools. I wasn't close to either of my parents and didn't feel affected by their deaths. I've just come out of a period of using. I actually feel good, and although full of angst about it all, I feel this is happening to someone else, not me. Philippa Perry replies, you say, I honestly feel my use is not problematic or doing me any harm, and I honestly think that if you really thought that, you wouldn't have written to me. But this is what the addiction monster does. It tells you that your habit is not a problem. It lies to you. It makes excuses. It squirms, wriggles and manipulates to keep you using. It tells you other people do it and are fine. It will always be able to make up convincing arguments as to why it's a good thing. One of its favourite messages to addicts of drugs and alcohol is saying you don't have a problem as you're not waking up in the gutter every morning. That's the addiction monster for you, always finding a reason to carry on. One thing an addiction does, and especially heroin, is to fill the void where relationships should have been. I'm sorry you did not have a strong feeling of belonging and being loved while growing up. You were passed around, sent away. It sounds like a strong bond was missing for you. The price of love is the pain of bereavement, and you've been spared that. But I think the cost to you is greater. It is hard to learn to love yourself when you haven't had a secure, loving home to come from. Heroin obliterates the need of love. Feeling an emptiness inside yourself with an addiction may be a pattern you inherited from your parents. Such a void is often the result of a lack of an early bond. I can't help but be suspicious that not being parented as you needed to have been will have left a wound, and that it's easier for you to use heroin to disconnect from it, rather than use sobriety to face and to heal. The past always affects the present, and it's good to know how, so that you can control it rather than be controlled by it. Your life, your heroin use is not happening to someone else, it's happening to you. It is an illegal drug, so you are committing a crime by being in possession of it and supporting crime by buying it. For now, perhaps, you feel in control of your habit as you feel you can periodically pause your usage. This proof of control may become more difficult to find in the future, as demonstrated by the fact that you are thinking about when to use again. I think Perry's description perfectly expresses both the sense of our turning away and of the resulting self-states of the user, by which I mean us. I don't know whether Perry chose to use this example in any kind of conscious relation to the annual campaign, now in October, it used to be Dry January, for the UK to pause its drinking for a month. As usual, this has produced a plethora of articles in the media from journalists and others about their personal experience of the alcohol shaming, my term, they have experienced at the hands of their own friends and family. If you stop or simply attempt to reduce your drinking, you've violated our societal norm around alcohol, and you will be shamed as a result. One writer describes the anonymous WhatsApp group she joined, where would-be non-drinkers can share the guilty secret of their desire to stop and the shaming they face when they try. We demand the assent of others to our worldview, best understood not so much as assent of explicit ideas, but as patterns of dissociation. For others to fail to dissociate along similar pathways challenges the coherence of our own self-states, resulting as they do from exactly those patterns of dissociation. To reprise our major theme, it's not so much about right and wrong, about do or don't, as about the causes of our turning away and the consequences of our doing so. Our delusive self-states will tend to blind us to both. Delusion. I'm specifically linking self-state and delusion here, and for a particular reason. I've been talking since the beginning about the assumptions and preconceptions that cause us to shape our seeing the world. I've also linked this to the Buddhist concept of the samskaras, the mental formations and their affective content. We can too easily think of these as things that I have, as ideas or some kind of mental contents of an independently existing mind. Bromberg's idea of shifting self-states returns us directly to our immediate experiencing and to its wholeness. This self-state is who I am right now. Bromberg talks of our sense of self as the ability to construct the idea of a continuous and unified self, my me, out of the reality of discontinuous and constantly shifting self-states, which we move between in relation to the needs of the moment. There is no simple way I can ever stand back from these to get a true, objective view, and in fact this idea itself makes no sense. Each self-state feels like me, and each is experienced as whole, as consistent with itself, despite each being the product of dissociation. But some self-states are more inclusive than others. Some can come to include what has previously been experienced as not me, as bad, dangerous, or completely other. So if we can come to understand delusion neither as a failure or a kind of madness, nor as a departure from some imagined initial or final clarity, then we can claim it and own it as what we all are. Embodied, mortal, vulnerable beings experiencing ourselves as the selves we've fabricated out of this moment by moment experiencing. We turn towards and we turn away. We see the world in the ways we do, and we tell stories of why this is the way it always was and always will be. It's the nature of our delusion to be invisible to us as delusion. The world really looks that way, feels that way, it makes sense that way. If I'm walking along the road and suddenly there's a large pink elephant stood in front of me, addressing me by name and telling me God wants me to do, well, whatever, we might hope that reason will kick in and I'll go, something's not quite right about this. But nevertheless, I do actually see the elephant, hear the elephant, and if in this self-state of mind pink elephants that talk do have a possible place in reality, they make sense, then I may well listen and do whatever it is I'm told to do. We first met this phenomenon in thinking about conspiracy delusions. If my samskaras, mental formations, predispose me to experience the world of myself in this or that way, then I will so experience it. These arrangements work as wholes. I can't just randomly change one element of it without reframing the whole, as all the other elements have to shift to accommodate. So whether it is that the world is ruled by space lizards, or that my heroin use is just me and harms no one, I really do experience the world this way. But I can never be free of delusion any more than I can be free of being this self-state in this moment. As Barry Magid never tires of saying, there is no delusion so deep as that delusion that I can be free of all delusion. As we have said, as embodied beings and hence mortal and vulnerable, this is our nature. But not all delusions are equal. Philip Bromberg argues that the function of psychoanalysis is to help us stand in the spaces between self-states, to experience their shifting nature and the unnoticed inconsistencies and contradictions within and between them. By so doing, we may come to allow ourselves to feel safe, to experience ourselves more inclusively, more whole, less subject to the specific dissociations which have formed the coping strategies that serve us so poorly. Our approach through Zen practice is in many ways analogous to this, that by paying attention to the shifting moment by moment play of experience which we each are, we may come to see ourselves as less separate, both within ourselves and between each other. We may come to experience more and experience more fully and experience ourselves as more whole with the world and whole within ourselves. And this inevitably involves turning outward to the world of which I am a part, to the causes of my turning away and the consequences of my actions. None of my engagement is, in this sense, neutral or without consequence. Our practice is exploration, not to determine in advance, not to tell us how we must or should think or behave. But this absolutely does not mean it doesn't matter what choices we make, or that it's all relative. If a popular working definition of madness is to keep repeating the same actions and expecting a different result, then by this standard we are all clearly mad. But equally clearly our investigations can lead us in the direction of becoming less so. While we can never stand back to get a view from nowhere, our patterns of dissociation clearly allow us to see aspects of our world more and less whole, and to act in ways that are more and less harming, both to ourselves and to others, whether those others are our intimate relationships or the collective body of which Thich Nhat Hanh speaks. Hormonal. We are embodied beings, and this body which I am is not something separate from an independently existing me. Yet, to say that somebody is hormonal is generally meant as a criticism, and when, as it so often is, applied to a woman, might be considered an actual slur. And yet, of course, we are all and always hormonal. This is simply how our bodies run themselves. My excitement, arousal, relaxation, distraction, boredom, sleep, and all the rest of my modes and moods are accompanied by a cocktail of hormones circulating in my bloodstream. My very experiencing of my emotions is, at least in one sense, the registering and awareness of the subtle and not so subtle gradients of the many different hormones as they're secreted and dispersed. My body chemistry, and with it my mood, clarity and focus, are actually influenced by all those substances and activities we might wish to include within the field of this precept, and not only those with a direct biochemical action. All that passes through what Buddhism describes as my sense gates, my sight, sound, smell, taste, touch, memory and thought, will arouse a hormonal response of some kind, will arouse emotion in me and quite possibly dissociation also. No wonder traditional Buddhism regarded all of these sense gates as potentially dangerous and stressed the need to guard them well. For the monk or nun, these are distractions that should be, and by choice are, reduced to a minimum. But for we who live in the world, there's no such simple choice, and nor should there be. Our senses are how we experience our world, with all its loves and desires, fears and loathings. This is my life. So do I embrace it or evade it? We do, though, have perhaps more varieties of sense experience available to us than any culture that's ever existed. My choice of virtually any stimulant, depressant or psychoactive substance is available at most within a mile or two, if I know who to ask, and failing that, there's always the internet. Talking of our screen culture, streaming services will bring a literally endless flow of TV, films and music specifically designed to capture my attention in whatever mood, self-state I might find myself or wish to be. Although some of the statistics often quoted for the percentage of internet traffic devoted to pornography are apparently wildly exaggerated, even the more conservative estimates are surprising to many of us. Perhaps 4% of sites and 14% of searches. Then there are gambling and gaming, or simply for that matter, scrolling. Here's a different modern statement of this precept from the Plum Village tradition of Thich Nhat Hanh. We are committed not to gamble or to use alcohol, drugs or any other product which brings toxins into our own and the collective body and consciousness, such as certain websites, electronic games, music, TV programs, films, magazines, books and conversations. We will consume in a way that preserves compassion, peace, joy and good health in our bodies and consciousness, and in the collective body and consciousness of our families, our society, and the earth. Practice questions. Does looking at this list help me see the breadth of my turnings away? Which are the most significant to me? What stories do I tell myself about what I'm turning towards? How do these two sides relate? We might question the use of toxins here, an obvious step from the idea of the collective body, but one that plays against the approach of it's not the substance, it's the use we make of it that we've seen with Diane Rossetto. And she's absolutely right, though we must also be careful here. It's not guns that kill people, it's people that kill. Or at least that's what the National Rifle Association always says. Actually, it's the combination of the two which is dangerous. And rather than locking up or executing all of the potential human killers, which is all of us, sanity suggests it might be more humane and effective to tackle the availability of the guns. You hopefully see my point. But in what way is this the same as, or different from, banning heroin and crack cocaine, or in not banning or more severely restricting the use of alcohol? What do we, whoever that is, require protecting from? And where do we feel that misuse by others should not be allowed to interfere with our own use? But what if it's actually me I'm talking about here, with the big stuff? We stress the non-judgmental attitude, and if we are to find any degree of self-honesty, then this is essential. But there will be a time to judge, though often simply to let me find my own way forward in my own time. But what if it is 2 bottles of vodka a day, or my shooting up? What if it's spending my days on incel websites, or gambling away my family's home without them knowing, or downloading child porn every night? What then? For most of us, most of the time, it's not that. But instead, any or all of those plethora of activities that clearly are neither good nor bad in themselves. Playing and watching sports, exercise, even the food that we eat. In fact, most of us lift our mood or counteract stress by eating. Chocolate, cookies, foods that remind us of childhood or happier times, or just the buzz of sugars and the satiety of fats. The pleasures of looking, smelling, tasting and chewing, of contrasting textures in the mouth. Is this in any way wrong or worrying? And yet we know that in the West, obesity is a massive and growing problem. We know that if we comfort eat too much, we may well end up comfort eating because we are so fat, or simply that it becomes our go-to response in any difficult situation. Clearly, this too is evading the painful truths of life. Whatever the particular form or the individual circumstances, underlying it all is this mechanism of turning away from my life without being aware that that's what I'm doing. Despite what I consciously believe and despite all the teachings pointing in the opposite direction of mindfulness and awareness, I obviously want to lead myself into ignorance, into dissociation, or at least a part of me does. There is a turning away from what hurts, or from what this part of me assumes is going to hurt. Perhaps the most widespread, severe social and chemical addiction in our culture has actually been nicotine, traditionally in the form of tobacco, but now increasingly as vaping. A lot of what goes for food goes for tobacco also. There's the action of holding between the fingers, the ritual, often social, of lighting the cigarette, and then the inhaling, the feel of the filter between the lips, the warmth of smoke, it's trailing off into the air, the fall of ash. The hand positions are smoking mudras. All this quite apart from the actual hit of nicotine. Now, who reaches for the cigarette? If I'm happily a smoker, this might seem an easy one to answer. Okay, but when it's my fifth attempt at quitting, and all my previous attempts have collapsed after a week or a month, then just who reaches for the cigarette? The nicotine? My body? My weakness? My badness? My will? My intention? Where will I land my judgment, and what's really going on? Likewise, when I'm pouring a beer, opening the biscuit tin, the cookie jar. Who? Any of these will show me, if I pause to notice, that I'm never simply one thing, a whole, undivided, unitary person. Different parts of me want different things, often in the same moment. Our relationships with our habits show us this very clearly and intimately. Habit is, of course, a long-standing slang for addiction. I need to feed my habit. How many of our habits are connected with evasion, momentary or sustained? Story time. Why was it so cool to smoke? Ask Hollywood. Long gone are the days when advertising depicted every smoker as a handsome cowboy or with the gold braid of an airline pilot, but the principles haven't changed. In what ways do these stories become our own? What do they reveal about ourselves and about our world, and what do they hide? This product will make me look good and feel good and give relief from the truths that worry me, and in some small way I'll become a different me, if only for a moment or two. There's no simple escape from these stories, of course. This is the culture, the society, which I inhale with every breath. And what when the stories themselves become the habit, the addiction? I might have got the idea that the real problem is the distraction offered by the sense pleasures, but the world of ideas can be equally and in some ways more involving. Any and all firmly held ideas that demand our unswerving belief, political, religious, and of course Buddhist ideas, can affect us very powerfully and over long periods of time. Political or ethical views that offer us any degree of certainty about how the world is or how it should be can in fact narrow and restrict our view of life, while at the same time creating a passionate conviction that we are correct and that only fools or devils could disagree with us. Displaced onto a great leader or an ideal, our desire for identity and certainty ceases to seem selfish at all in the conventional sense, and we may even offer ourselves up for metaphorical or even literal martyrdom for the cause. Buddhism is not different from any other practice, and its ideas, ideals and rituals are certainly included here. Even the technicalities and sense of purpose of practice itself can become habitual and relied on in ways that may be both damaging and supportive. In prison, for instance, possessions are extremely few, and there's little or no opportunity to control an environment where the smells of confinement, of aging buildings with limited access to hygiene and accumulated frustration combine to create a pervasive cocktail of odours. Here, the burning of incense takes on a major importance. The ability to create a familiar and welcome fragrance through one's own ritual and a time of one's choosing can be hugely comforting and grounding, but where's the line between being supported by this and dependent on it? Its use can become obsessive, and even the prospect of its absence traumatic. In this way, incense assumes a significance impossible to imagine for those outside the prison system, outside that context. Even precept practice itself and the sense of purpose and identity created through it can become a turning away rather than towards my life. If I'm convinced that this is the right path and everyone else is wrong, then I'm clearly caught up in the world of views. There's also the pervasive idea found in many Buddhist schools that what I'm looking for is the right state of mind, whether that be pure consciousness, calm, or equanimity. Even mindfulness and awareness can come to be seen in this light. There is happy Buddhism, the kind that suggests that if I just do the practice right, then I'll get to see reality as it is and inevitably be happy as a consequence. Hence, if I'm not happy right now, then I'm clearly not doing it right. Or unhappy Buddhism that sees all of us as hopeless slackers who will never attain the level of constant and concentrated mindfulness of Sei and Ajahn Chah, and so we will never finally transcend the suffering of our present state of delusion and defilement, which is the whole purpose of the practice itself. In either case, what is on offer is a version of control and safety, searching to find or giving up hope of finding the mental state that would put me in control and that has the sanction of those I truly believe are my spiritual superiors. There's a particular rigidity and inflexibility that may come with this kind of sustained intensity as a result of the effort of will required and the striving for, always incomplete, mastery. A striving which may at any point collapse under its own weight, leaving the complementary experience of failure, self-recrimination, an experiencing of self-judgment from which we will be only too happy to turn away in order to continue our search for the next product, the next fix, the next demagogue or spiritual leader, by which we can only ever compound our real experience of suffering. Practice question. Has my own practice ever produced this kind of search in me? How did that work out for us? The rights and wrongs of right and wrong. We talk rightly of being non-judgmental in our awareness. Should and should not are death to self-honesty. I feel the way I feel. I want what I want. And I feel and want differently from day to day, moment to moment. In my exploration of what appears as me, I feel and I follow my feelings as they unfold, the thoughts arising and fading that accompany them. My investigation itself is not a neutral or distanced activity, and if I sustain my practice, it can and it will change how I feel, how I think, and so also how I consequently act. It's not that right and wrong, or as modern Buddhism likes to say, wholesome and unwholesome. It's not that these actions don't figure, but that we can't assume them in advance or derive them a priori. Being what looks like right may prove very wrong in this particular context. And the attempt to distinguish one from the other may itself lead directly to harming, born of deepening our delusion of our moralizing separation into good and bad, us and them. Righteousness is rarely appropriate, and our attempts to imagine we can get on the right side of any issue are always problematic. We've touched on many ways of evading the painful truths of life, and one of these painful truths is that our need to know, to be right, and so to be safe from shame and from other harm, is itself a cause of suffering and harming. And yet, both as individuals and as a society, we need to act and hence judge, and realise that our inaction is always also an action and a judgment in itself. No escape. We are part of this world, down and dirty with it. I chose to use Philippa Perry's response to her heroin user because in this case the issue is crystal clear. Heroin use places us squarely on the wrong side of the law. We know that the use of any illegal drug goes directly to fund organised crime and the exploitation and violence that is part and parcel of that illegal trade. Without question, true. Though we might well ask, why are heroin and cocaine illegal when we can and do freely use alcohol in such collectively damaging ways? In reality, of course, the situation is complex. The history of alcohol use in Western culture is very different in its breadth and scope from that of the drugs we make illegal. We are not starting from year zero, day one, and should not pretend we can do. Yet the majority of the consequences of illegal drug use are as a direct result of their illegality. Complete lack of quality control and reliable information, the miserable lack of treatment centres and effective management lead to longer and more dangerous addiction. The illegal trade in drugs produces horrendous levels of violence and exploitation. But the existence of this trade is itself the direct consequence of the illegality of the prescribed substances. The war on drugs has been in full swing internationally for a little over a century, and in its own terms of reference has been a catastrophic and chronic failure. A failure too, and this time admitted as such, was the United States' attempt to include strong alcohol within that war during the Prohibition years that ended in 1933. As it became clear that the measures enjoyed only limited popular support, the legislation was repealed and an amendment to the Constitution added. The traditional ubiquity of alcohol made it impractical to ban, although all states do exercise some controls over its legal production and consumption, and get considerable tax revenue by so doing. The case was very different for other drugs to which Western governments have complex relationships. Opium, the source of heroin, was used by 19th century British governments as a directly socio-economic and political weapon against Imperial China. Opium grown within the British Empire was imported into China to produce millions of addicts as eager consumers and to destabilise Chinese society sufficiently to make it politically and militarily incapable of resisting the drug's importation. Chinese hegemony in East Asia was thereby broken, and the ensuing warfare and societal collapse ended only with the communist victory following the Second World War. The memory of Britain's part in this is one important strand in China's continuing fear of and hostility towards the West. So, in the short term, this proved a highly effective strategy, and one that was, in Europe and the US, accompanied by the demonization of all Chinese as being drug-crazed opium addicts who posed an existential danger to civilized Western society, and of course specifically to white women. It was this same racial stereotype that, as Johann Hari has shown in Chasing the Scream, 2015, was in the early years of the 20th century used as a rationale behind making opioids illegal in the United States, a racial panic used as a political control, parallel to the limiting of Chinese immigration, of the rapidly growing population of Chinese Americans. As Hari further shows, this same strategy, criminalising specific drugs, but in this case those favoured by black communities, was an important component of the racism of the Jim Crow era, as one part of the response to the fears of white elites following on from post-Civil War Reconstruction. To come closer to the present, Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow from 2010 showed conclusively that the intensification of the war on drugs from the 1980s onwards was organised, promoted and funded with the covert, and frankly often not so covert, intention of undermining the advances won by the civil rights movement. Alexander demonstrates exactly how the creation and disciplining of a huge black underclass of lawbreakers, fabricating the symbolic equation of blackness with criminality, the majority of black Americans were thereby effectively denied the political, economic and social equality they were now formally and legally guaranteed. As a strategy of racial and class control, the war on drugs has been and remains effective. While driven by domestic American and European demand, much drug production has been effectively outsourced to countries such as Colombia, Mexico and Afghanistan. Remembering too, of course, that the most effective campaign against heroin production was that carried out by the Taliban, it seems incontrovertible, whatever intentions we place in the mind of those involved, that the war on drugs has created far more harm than it's ever prevented, and that this was so from its beginning. Our images of the other have been shaped by this. In terms of our ordinary mind way of looking at the precepts, it's clear that in defining a section of our society as dangerously and differently other, the addict, the dealer, potentially everyone who's black, Chinese, Hispanic, our governments have created a collective delusion far more dangerous than any clouding of my individual consciousness. Anything that I might bring about, although this is the context in which we normally discuss this precept. It's interesting that this plays to racial stereotyping of the worst sort. Non-whites are irrational and devious, and we, the whites, need to resist at all costs being polluted by them. Or, if we are black, to show by our words and actions that we are the right sort of black woman or man. This is the argument for slavery and for colonialism and exploitation of every kind, even for genocide. By separating off our own collective badness in the figure of the other, we obscure the real issues of our society. This is a misdirection of our collective attention, and while we're all to some degree complicit in this, for some it has been and remains their cynical and direct intention to deflect our attention, to misdirect us in our perception and understanding of our world. We can actually widen this argument into a more general one about the social and political effects of our turnings away. The poet Juvenal coined the phrase bread and circuses 2,000 years ago to describe a Roman populace whose political apathy and even loyalty to their master's interests could be bought by a dole of grain and lavish public entertainments. When Marx wrote of religion as the opium of the people, he too was pointing to the turning away from the direct experiencing of our difficult and often painful collective reality towards the other worlds of heaven and drug use. Our distractions are not simply our turning away. Our dissociation from our individual dis-ease, whether that be rooted in trauma or simply the difficulties of this moment, but turning away from the collective, social, political, and yes, personal consequences of a society based in the generation of inequality and insatiable competition. This has served some unimaginably well, and many of us all too poorly. It's towards looking this reality in the eye that our attention will turn with the next precept. We turn away and we turn away. There is much to turn away from, far more than any of us can bear. We can at least bear witness to this turning and investigate it as best we may. As for each of us, it shows up as and in me. I cannot step outside my culture or myself. I am always and forever a part of it. Back to Vimalakirti's I am sick because the world is sick. Hence this investigation of ourselves and the world needs to be gently and kindly and generously done. There is far more to turn away from than any of us can bear. If we persist in our investigations, if we come back and back and back, we may begin to gain insights about ourselves as we are in the present and as we have been in the past. These insights may hopefully help us to see and to experience ourselves as not separate from our embodiment as social beings. We may come to see the dependence of the patterning of our turnings on our collective delusion and dissociation, manifesting in our collective requirements, our assumptions, our ideas. The precept won't ever tell you the purpose or the consequences of your or my opening the fridge, scrolling on the sofa, turning on the TV. Your practice, and my practice, will do this if we allow it to develop and to deepen. My investigation of my own patterns of reaction and response will definitely bring about changes, though exactly what these will be I'll have to find out as I go. My behaviours shift and adjust. My thinking acknowledges the full complexity of the given situation in which I or we or the world find ourselves. Placing my own responses in this broader context can show me, on the one hand, my own complicities, cowardices and heroism, and that it's not about me at all, but the way we find ourselves thrown into a world which is not of our choosing, and yet is still our world and our only world. The world we love.